I'd like to tell you a few things about George Leighton in the event that some of you do not know about his life, and then about a few of his contributions. George Leighton is now 101 2/3 years old. This photograph was taken when he was 98. To put things in context, William Howard Taft was President of the United States when George Leighton was born on October 22nd, 1912. George was the son of parents who were born in the Cape Verde Islands off the northwestern coast of Africa. No English was spoken in his home. The family spoke Creole, a dialect that was based on African dialects and Portuguese. George went to a one-room schoolhouse through the 7th grade. When he left school and never attended high school. As a child, George spent 7 or 8 months a year picking blueberries, cranberries, and strawberries, and on his 100th birthday, he took Tom Sullivan, my wife Nancy, and me, and pointed out to us where he picked cranberries in the patch that still exists near New Bedford, Massachusetts. George was a captain in World War II. He fought at Guadalcanal, Morganville, Green Island, and Finch Island, and was awarded a Bronze Star. But when he was 24 years old, before the war, he enrolled as a provisional student at Howard University in Washington, D.C., and then graduated Phi Beta Kappa and was awarded a scholarship to go to Harvard Law School. He graduated from Harvard Law School after the war and moved to Chicago in 1946, he says, because Big Bill Dawson was an African-American man who was a congressman from Chicago. He wanted to come to a city where African-Americans could serve in public office. When George moved to Chicago, he could not join the Chicago Bar Association. He could not rent space in the Loop. He could not eat in most restaurants in the Loop. He could not get picked up by taxi cabs, and he was not permitted to be a member of this august club. As a lawyer, George fought race discrimination in housing, education, voting, jury selection in Illinois, and throughout the Deep South. In 1964, he was elected a judge of the Circuit Court of Cook County. In 1967, he became an appellate court justice. And in 1976, a Republican president chose George Leighton to be a federal district court judge. George had been a lifelong Democrat. Things have changed a little bit in those years. George retired from the bench in 1987 at the age of 75, and then he practiced law for 24 years with Earl Neal, Lang Neal, Jeanette Sublett, and their spectacular colleagues at what is now called Neal Leroy. George retired at the age of 99 in 2011. And I can tell you the only reason he retired was because of mandatory CLE requirements. So today, Judge Leighton has the post office in New Bedford, Massachusetts, named after him. As Judge Evans noted, and Judge Evans and Judge Beeble were instrumental in this, the courthouse at 26th Street is now named after him. And George Leighton truly loves being a member of the Youth League Club. So, that's George Leighton. Here are but a few examples of the extraordinary contributions he's made to improving our criminal justice system. And I will skip through some of this because I know that people need to read. But the examples in 5 categories, as Judge Evans mentioned: George Leighton as a defendant, George Leighton as a lawyer, as a judge, as an opponent of the death penalty, and finally as a beggar for justice. George as a defendant. It was 1951. George Leighton advised Mr. and Mrs. Clark that the lease they signed to move into an apartment in Cicero, Illinois, was legal and binding. They started moving their belongings into the apartment, and a race riot ensued. More than 2,000 white people burned buildings in the neighborhood of that apartment building in Cicero. A grand jury was convened. The grand jury indicted George Leighton and others for conspiracy to diminish property values and conspiracy to incite a race riot. As Judge Evans noted, and I thank him so much, and Judge Beeble, for getting these materials, Thurgood Marshall came from New York to represent George Leighton. This is a copy of the appearance form Thurgood Marshall, Judge Evans, and Judge Beeble retrieved for us. They filed a motion to quash the indictment, and the state agreed to dismiss the charges against Judge Leighton. Noli pros up in the top. Judge Beeble does that all the time. For our community, this was an extraordinary event. But for George Leighton, as those of you who have spoken to him know, he defines this as one of the most important moments in his life, because the lesson for him was that when he became a judge, he always thought about a case from the perspective of the judge, but also what it was like for the defendant to be standing there facing criminal charges, as George Leighton did. Another example: Robert Goldsby was indicted in Carroll County, Mississippi in 1954 for killing a white woman. The killing occurred, according to the Fifth Circuit's opinion, after the woman's husband ordered, quote, Negroes, end quote, to leave his gas station and dairy barn. Mr. Goldsby, through an aunt in Chicago, hired George Leighton to come down to Carroll County, Mississippi to try his case. When he got there, the white lawyers in Mississippi refused to participate in a case with a so-called Negro lawyer. So George was discharged. Goldsby was convicted, sentenced to die. On appeal, George took over the appeal, convinced the Fifth Circuit that the motion that George had prepared but was never filed, claiming that there was race discrimination in the manner in which the grand juries and the petty juries were selected, was true, and conviction was reversed. Nepew versus Illinois. Henry Nepew was convicted in Cook County in 1938 for murdering a policeman, sentenced to 199 years in prison. George Leighton was later appointed to represent him, filed a post-conviction motion claiming that the prosecutors knew that witness had perjured himself when he said that there was no leniency or promises of leniency. It went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. George prevailed, and on remand, Mr. Nepew was released from custody. Those are a few examples in the criminal justice area. George as a judge. 6 months after George Leighton became a state court judge, he presided in a bench trial over a case involving 2 men accused of attacking a police officer. He found them not guilty. The police department asked for George Leighton's resignation. The police department asked that he be sent out of the criminal courts. J. Edgar Hoover condemned the state court judge in Chicago, George Leighton. The Chicago Tribune editorialized against him, and thankfully, the judges of the Circuit Court of Cook County, the presiding judges, the executive committee, ruled in George's favor and refused to remove him from 26th Street. This isn't about whether George was right or wrong. This is about judicial independence, and to the credit of the Circuit Court of Cook County, they stood behind George Leighton. And George, this is in his first 6 months as a judge. George and the death penalty. This is from the 1964 Saturday Evening Post. Lloyd Miller was accused of killing Janice May and raping her, a young girl in downstate Illinois. This is a picture of George from the Saturday Evening Post in 1964. Key piece of evidence in Miller versus Pate, for some of those who don't know it, was prosecution evidence that they found the little girl's underwear with blood on it, and it was her blood. Case goes all the way through the state court system. George Leighton and Willard Lazarus, with an expert, discovered that this was not blood at all. This was red paint. And they prevail, and Mr. Miller is released. And last, Townsend versus Sane. George twice argued the Townsend case in the United States Supreme Court. It defined, at least before Congress passed the anti-terrorism limitations on habeas corpus, Townsend, through George Leighton's efforts, defined when an individual is entitled to an evidentiary hearing in challenging a state court conviction. Lastly, George as a beggar. I had the extraordinary experience of going to Governor Quinn with about a half a dozen Jenner and Block lawyers and George Leighton to urge the governor to sign the legislation abolishing the death penalty. The lawyers, including myself, made legal arguments to the governor as to why he should sign this legislation. And George Leighton was our final speaker. At the age of 98 in 2011, George said this to Governor Quinn in his deep and melodic voice. Governor, I'm not here to make legal arguments. I'm here as a beggar for justice. And I implore you to sign this legislation and bring Illinois back into the civilized world. It was one of the most moving things I've ever seen. And it would have been moving if he had been 40 years old. But to see your father, Barbara, conduct himself like that with the governor, and really, it was instrumental. Several years ago, in conclusion, then Senator Barack Obama wrote a letter to George Leighton, noting the words of Dr. King, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice, and it takes people like George Leighton to bend it." So I hope this short presentation has given you some idea of the extraordinary contributions of this amazing man and why he is a very worthy recipient of an award named after the beloved Norval Morris.
A thinking being.